mysteries of creation are there. Up in the sky. Up in the sky. The moon and the planets are there. And new hopes for knowledge and peace are there.
The United States Pluto Return. What does it mean, and what insights can it give us about the crisis of our time? The crisis of our time as a nation, the crisis of our time as a world, and the opportunity of our time as a nation, as a world. So first off, what is a return? In astrology, a return is when a planet returns to the point in the sky where it was when something was born. So for example, when a human being turns 12 years old, Jupiter returns to the point in the sky where it was when that person was born, because it takes Jupiter 12 years to go around the zodiac to orbit the sun one time. So when we turn 12 years old, Jupiter returns to the point in the sky where it was when we were born. And in astrology, each planet has a symbolism associated with it called its archetype. And when a return happens, there's a sort of a doubling up of that symbolism. And so the symbolism of Jupiter has to do with expansion and growth. And when a human being turns 12, they enter into puberty. They oftentimes experience growth spurts. So that's the archetype of Jupiter getting activated by the Jupiter return. Another example of a return is called the Saturn return. Saturn takes roughly 28 years to go around the zodiac one time, orbit the sun one time. And the symbolism of Saturn has to do with maturity, responsibility, the role that we play, and the responsibility that we take on. And so when we turn 28 years old, there's a doubling up of that symbolism, and we enter into a period of our life in which our life track becomes more substantial. We take on more responsible roles in society. So in astrology, there isn't a power that the planets exert over us. There's no force that the planets exert over us. Astrology functions along the principle of reflection. And as such, the bodies that we see in space reflect our inner space. So for instance, if we look up into the sky and we see the sun and the moon, that reflects the yin and the yang principles inside ourselves that are kind of at the fore, because those are the first celestial bodies that we'll see, the sun and the moon, the first and the largest. And those reflect the yin and yang principles inside us that are at the fore. We look deeper into space, we're looking at celestial bodies that are further away, which reflect deeper space within us. Just like the celestial bodies that we look at further away take longer to orbit around the zodiac, longer to orbit around the sun. Jupiter takes 12 years, Saturn's further out, it takes 28 years. The further we look into space, the deeper the depth that is being reflected of our inner space. And there's what's called the outer planets, which are Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. And those planets are so far into outer space that they can't be seen with the naked eye. We require a telescope to see them. And they reflect such profound, mysterious depths inside ourselves, in our inner space, that we actually need a telescope, some type of introspective tool to be able to contact those depths inside ourselves. So the Pluto return, Pluto is so far out that the return takes 248 years. Now, no human being goes through a Pluto return. No human being lives to be 248 years old. In fact, few nations even live to be 248 years old. A nation has to be considerably old in order to experience a Pluto return. So what is the archetype of Pluto? What is the symbolism of Pluto? So to help us understand the symbolism of Pluto, let's look at an example in which Pluto entered into the sign of Capricorn. So Pluto is associated with the death rebirth process that exists in life outside of us. It can be observed around us everywhere. It can be observed inside ourselves. The death rebirth process, Pluto is associated with transformation. Pluto is associated with power struggles. So as an example, Pluto entered into Capricorn it began to enter into Capricorn in 2008, 2009. And the symbolism of Capricorn has to do with institutions. Financial institutions, institutions of law, institutional authorities. These are associated with Capricorn. And so Pluto, the archetype of of transformation, the archetype of the death, rebirth process, power struggles, entered into Capricorn, 2008, 2009. That's when there was the collapse of the world economy, and the financial institutions of that time underwent a death rebirth process. By 2011, there was a very dramatic power struggle going on involving kind of the population, the populace, and the financial struggles. There was something called the Occupy movement, Occupy Wall Street, in which there was a demand for a kind of a death rebirth process for the financial institutions to go through. That there was the kind of the old ways that were no longer serving anyone, that were no longer really serving the collective, so that there was a death and rebirth process that was called for there. And we can see also in that when Pluto entered into Capricorn, there's also been a sort of death rebirth process involving the institution of law, the institution of the police in this country, in the United States. And so there we see Pluto. Another way of describing the symbolism of Pluto is there's a Plutonic principle that exists within the human body, the physical body, in which if we have a infection that gets underneath the skin, the body has a way of creating something that's like a boil to expel that infection, to kind of get that material up and out of the body, so that there's a healing basis to this process. But when we lance a boil, or when we have to clean out the pus of a wound that has become infected, it's quite unsightly at first. And so Pluto is associated with that whole process. It's associated with the innate biological impulse to get an infection up and out of the system. It's associated with the pus. It's associated with the unsightly process of kind of purging something from our system. And it's associated with the healing that happens from purging that from our system. And so in the ingress and transit of Pluto through the sign of Capricorn, there's kind of a bubbling up of the underbelly, the kind of hidden infectious underbelly that exists in the institutions of the United States, also of the world, because that's a transit for the entire world. So we can see how the behavior of the police force and the relationship of the population with the law enforcement is kind of bubbling up this pus, this infected kind of negativity that has been there all along, but now it's coming up and out, and we're experiencing the unsightly nature of the expulsionary quality of Pluto, of wanting to get something up and out and expel it from the tissues of the collective body, so that to get rid of that infected quality. So we can see Pluto, we get to know Pluto, the archetype of Pluto, through watching Pluto's transit through the sign of Capricorn. There's another example of Pluto's transit through the sign of Capricorn that is the legalization of psychedelic medicine, psychedelic therapy, psychedelic assisted therapy. So in Pluto entered Capricorn, like we said, 2008, 2009, and into the early 2010s, we can see how the research in the field of therapeutic use of psychedelics increased at that time, and there became a noticeable movement of that therapeutic modality toward legalization. And so that's an example of how the legal institutional structures associated with Capricorn began to integrate into themselves something that is Plutonic. So Pluto's transiting through Capricorn, and Capricorn, the institutional nature of our collective, is integrating into its very body itself something that is Plutonic. Now, what does that mean by something that is Plutonic? The therapeutic use of psychedelics is actually very Plutonic, in such a way that the body, just like we use that example of how the body has an innate process inside itself that can allow an infection to be expelled from its body. Similarly, if we were to eat something that is toxic to us, the body will naturally contract and make us vomit and make us expel that thing. So the body has innate plutonic qualities inside it that will want to expel that which is not helpful to the system. And similarly, the psyche has the same quality. The psyche can actually heal itself by expelling those elements inside itself that have become toxic to itself, that have become infectious. And psychedelic medicine actually catalyzes that. It catalyzes that process. So in this form of therapy, the elements inside the psyche that are not really they're not really helpful to the psyche anymore. They are actually harmful to the psyche. They come up and they come out. And that's oftentimes through it can be through unpleasant experiences, just like we talked about the unsightly nature of lancing a boil, cleaning out pus from a wound. Something can come up and out of the psyche. And once we get past that unsightly part of the process, we get to celebrate that something has been released. There's a cathartic quality there that actually frees up the individual. And through that process, the individual actually notices that they've gone through a death rebirth process. It's very Plutonic. They've gone through a death rebirth process, and they become transformed. They've become transformed in the sense that they have released something that was associated with their old identity and stepped into a new identity. So this is another example of the Plutonic and in action, and it's another example of the archetype of Pluto in the sign of Capricorn, something that's a very Plutonic therapy getting integrated into the law structures, the institutional structures of the world, of the United States. Now, there's another psychedelic assisted therapy that can help us understand Pluto at an even deeper depth, and it's very helpful to us. So this deeper depth has to do with the initial wave of clinical research into psychedelic assisted therapy, which took place in the 1950s, 60s, and early 70s. During that time, clinical researchers noticed that during the process of a deep transformative inward therapeutic process involving psychedelics, in which, just like we talked about, these kind of aspects of the psyche that are no longer needed come up and get released out, and the individual is transformed. During that process, at times, researchers noticed that human beings actually have the potential to relive their own birth. And it was at that time that archetypal astrology was discovered in the 1970s, actually, in which researchers discovered that astrology could give insight into the experiences that people underwent in psychedelic assisted therapy. And one of the most notable examples is that the archetype of Pluto was illuminated by the process in which an individual re-experiences their own birth. And as a transformative process, they get reborn in a sense. That's very Plutonic, death rebirth process. And there's a specific part of the process of death rebirth that is associated with Pluto. And that is when the baby is being pressed through the birth canal by these powerful forces, powerful propulsive forces propelling the child, the baby through the birth canal. And that imprint on the human psyche matches the symbolism of Pluto pretty much one for one. Why is that? Because when the human baby is going through the birth canal, they stand at the threshold. They're about to come out the other side, which is the successful birth. But it's such a dangerous moment before that successful birth because they're being crushed by intense pressure. So they are, for the first time in their existence, being succumbed to death right at the threshold of birth because they're being crushed. But yet that crushing leads to birth, which is an expanding decompression into a whole new world of existing. And so there's what gets activated in the human psyche at that time, as noted by researchers observing people who are reliving their birth, is that there's a feeling of being up against titanic structures that are in a dynamic power struggle with oneself. And because the baby is not yet born, they haven't become differentiated from the mother. There isn't really a clear identification with I'm the baby and this is the mother. There's just a sense that both are exerting pressure on each other. So the mother's exerting pressure on the baby and the baby's exerting pressure on the mother. And so there's a sense there that there's this kind of dynamic power struggle in which in some ways there can be an identification with the mother and with the contractions that want to compress the baby and get it out. In some instances, there can be identification with the baby that is an innocent body at the behest of these crushing pressures. So that is a clear description of the Plutonic archetype. And that can give us some insight into the United States Pluto return. When we look at in 2014, Pluto came within 15 degrees of the point in the sky in which Pluto was when the United States was born. And so because Pluto return happens quite rarely, astrologers have not yet come to a consensus about how close, what orb of influence, how many degrees close to the original position of birth activates the return. So 15 degrees was in 2014. By the time we got to 2016, Pluto was in 10 degrees, a very reasonable orb to think about something as large as a Pluto return. And so in 2016, we see the inauguration of Donald Trump, which is very much a kind of personification of some of the kind of ugliest sides of the United States. So we can think of that pus metaphor and that metaphor of the boil and how Pluto wants something, the kind of infectious material to come up and out through that boil and that lancing of that boil. And so we can see at that time Donald Trump coming up and being a kind of a human personification of some of the worst qualities of the United States. And so we see there how what was lying kind of more in the sordid underbelly really comes to the top. It comes to the top and it becomes a magnifying point that the collective culture is almost magnified to, like a moth to flame, because it's that Plutonic process that's happening, and it's like a baby going through birth. The contractions are happening, and there isn't where the full system of the mother and the baby are pulled into the process, just like a moth gets pulled into the flame of the candle. And so Trump comes in, and the entire collective psyche gets activated towards this Plutonic process. We can also see at that time this increasing prevalence of police violence, shootings, essentially murders. And we can see how there's, again, this institutional underbelly of the United States coming up and wielding its head so that we can see it in a Plutonic fashion, that unsightly sense. African-American communities, kind of these realities that come up out of the shadows of this police brutality and get seen by the entire nation. And school shootings increasingly, as Pluto comes into exactitude, which is this year, 2022, is the exact point. So between 2014, 2016, 2022, there's been an increasing activation of the US Pluto return, school shootings, the sense of this underbelly of the United States really coming up and out and being seen and being very unsightly, very toxic. And so the Plutonic return wants to bring these things up and out and expel them so that we can go through a healing process. We also can see the Pluto return in terms of now abortion as a very kind of poignant example of the Plutonic energies at play. Because on both sides of the issue, you see people passionately magnetized towards towards kind of working against the other side. There's kind of there's an oppositional quality there. Again, like a moth towards flame, these two sides get activated and get into a kind of almost like life or death struggle of opposition with each other. And on one hand, we have the identification with the child in the birthing process, that there's these large contraction, like almost like mechanical, institutional, larger than life contractions being engaged upon the innocent child. And so on one hand, we can see that as the pro-choice movement has an argument for that the individuals want to keep their rights against this larger than life institutional America that wants to constrict and control the rights and kind of capture and compress the individual. And then on the other side, we see the pro-life feeling as if there's this kind of amoral force that wants to, again, the innocence of the child, wants to crush it, kill it. And so what's activated inside is a sort of a very deep, just like Pluto's deep in space, it's a deep strata of the individual psyche that's being activated. And it's actually the same psyche and the same level that's being activated on both sides. It's just that both sides are kind of seeing it slightly from a different angle and seeing the other as the opposition force. And so each one is locked in a birth or death struggle. Each one is seeing the other as the constrictive, contracting force. Now, there's the positive aspect of the Pluto archetype is that when the boils lance, all the infection gets out, there's a freedom, there's a catharsis there. When the baby is born through the crushing contractions on the other side of it, there's a freedom, there's a release into birth. And that's in astrology, that's associated with the archetype of Uranus. Uranus is the archetype of release, freedom, birth, a successful birth. And so my frame that I have to offer you today is that the United States is, through its Pluto return, having a death rebirth process. It's having a process in which it's going through a birth. And what is on the other side of that birth, we don't know yet. We don't know, but just the fact that you're here, you're listening, I'm here talking about astrology is hopeful, in the sense that from the astrological perspective, there can be on the other side of a kind of collective psychospiritual rebirth of an entire nation, a new worldview. And that worldview, if we look at it through the astrological lens, could involve a very different perspective of what it means to be an individual, what it means to be a part of a collective. For instance, in astrology, we look out into space to see reflected the space inside us. So to understand the space inside us, we look into space. We look at the sun, moon, Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto, the depths of the space within us reflected in the depth of the space without us, right? So similarly, when we look at the space outside of us, it doesn't just reflect the space inside of us, it also reflects our life. We can look at our life stages. Like, for instance, if you look at the Saturn return, when we become more mature, when we take on a more responsible role in society, that maturity manifests inside. But when we take on a more responsible role in society, that's happening around us. That's happening in relationship to the world around us. So the movements of the planets, the cycles of the planets, what they reflect about us has to do with our inner space, our feelings inside ourselves. It also has to do with our life path outside of us. So if I go through my Saturn return and I experience more maturity inside me, I might get a new job or something like that outside of me. That opportunity arises outside of me. I meet a new boss who represents a kind of healthy sense of authority, or I become a boss. I interact with employees, coworkers. I interact with the world around me. So those events outside of me are just as much reflected in the movements of the heavens as my inner space. So inside, outside, what's happening in the heavens, all reflections of each other. So that is to say that the people I meet outside of me are not necessarily separate from me. They are also my life unfolding. The people you meet outside of you, those are also your life unfolding. So in the example of pro-choice versus pro-life, you know, if somebody is pro-choice meeting somebody pro-life, that's their life. You know, those people are that's the story of their life unfolding. So that person isn't separate from them. That person is a part of their life. Similarly, a pro-life meets a pro-choice. You know, we can think, oh, you're wrong, I'm right. But actually, that's your life you're looking at, because that's your life story unfolding. Your life story isn't just limited to what happens inside your body. Then you could just be in a pod separate from the whole world and experience your life. Your life is actually the whole stage and the whole play and the whole story, including everybody in it. So there isn't any real separation, just like there isn't separation between the inner space and the outer space. We're not separate from the sun, the moon, Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto. Those are two, the inner space, the outer space, two sides of one coin. The people we meet and our own person, two sides of one coin. So this is a different way of looking at life, looking at the world. It's a way that really allows the human being to access a fundamental sense of love, a fundamental sense of participation in life, a fundamental sense that we are life. We don't have to identify so much with a separate ego or an existential sense of separation. We actually are life. Just like the baby and the contractions that are happening against the baby, there's a wrestling going on there, but it's all life. The mother's trying to give birth to new life. The baby's trying to be life, new life being born. There isn't any oppositional thing there. So similarly, in the United States, we're really struggling against our sense of separation, that's something that would make us actually shoot and kill another person. There's got to be a deep sense of wounding separation there. And so we have an opportunity here to be reborn as a nation. 2025, Uranus, we start to enter into the 10-degree orb of the United States Uranus return. You may remember that I mentioned Uranus is the archetype that's associated with the stage of birth that's after Pluto, the release, the baby is born, the freedom, the decompression, the liberation. So there is a frame for you to see the US Pluto return as not just the negativity that is arising, but what's on the other side of it. What's on the other side of this death rebirth process that we're really going through as a nation. We are going through it. There's no denying it. And the role that we can play for the world moving forward by seeing this birth process through. So I'm James Moran. I'm archetypal astrologer. The summer of 2022, summer of the exact Pluto return, I'm going to be leading a study group for those of you that want to know more about the path of astrology as a personal path, the path of psychedelic assisted therapy as a personal path, the ways that they complement each other as I demonstrated through this talk. I'm going to be leading a study group. You're welcome to join. Click on the link below. So hopefully this has been a helpful contextualization and framing the crisis of our time as a nation, also as a world, so that we can understand the process that we're going through collectively. We can have a sense of where it could be leading us, the positive directions of where it could be leading us. So thank you so much for being here with me today. And I look forward to crossing paths with you. I wish you a beautiful path of decompression, liberation, so that you can feel the positive sides of these archetypal energies, and you can thrive in your life. So thank you so much.